I know there's this romanticized idea of cramming 4 people into a 1 bedroom apartment to make rent, and if that works for you, then that's fine, but with that many people, you can almost always find a reasonably priced house to rent instead. So you're getting ready to move out of your parents' house for the first time. You've spent a few nights away from home in the past, but you're still nervous about starting this new part of your life. If that sounds familiar, that's because a lot of us have been in that exact situation before. I know when I first moved out, I had no idea what to expect, which is why today I'm telling you what you should look for, what you should avoid, and some things to consider when you're looking for your first apartment. We'll also go over how much you can afford to rent and how to get the most out of your money for the rent, so let's jump into it. Okay, first we're looking at things you should stay away from if at all possible, starting with renting sight unseen. What this means is you do your Google searches, you find an apartment with some nice pictures, you apply and sign the lease, all without ever physically going to the apartment. Now it goes without saying, pictures are only going to show you the best parts of an apartment and leave you totally clueless to the problem areas. That's why even if you're pretty sure you found the perfect apartment for you, you should always check it out first to avoid any unpleasant surprises. To go on with that last tip, you need to be making sure you read your lease agreement in its entirety because every lease is going to be slightly different. Things like how long are you renting for, at what price, does that price ever change, are utilities included? All of that information is in your lease, so you need to be making sure you read it to make sure you're entering a fair agreement. Now let's move on to the apartment itself and what to look for to avoid there. If there's visible damage to the apartment, that's something you should definitely ask about, and if you do end up moving into that unit, make sure you're taking plenty of pictures when you do so. And if there's water damage or a bad smell coming from the apartment, you should probably take that as a sign not to move there, because that means that management either isn't doing regular upkeep, or they have a problem that they don't know about, which is only going to cause you headaches down the line. One of the biggest mistakes that first-time renters make is renting a place that costs over half of what they make per month. Sure, you can technically afford it, but it really doesn't leave much money for things like groceries and utilities, plus all of the things that fall outside of those two categories. And that's why you need to know what you can afford to rent. The general rule for this is you should only be paying about 1/3 to 1/2 of your monthly income to rent, which means if you make $2,400 a month, you should only be paying about $800 per month in rent. Obviously, if you make something like $10,000 a month, you can afford to break this rule a bit, but if you're making that much money, you should really be buying a house rather than renting, but we'll get into that maybe in a different video. So assuming you're not making $10,000 a month, your options for renting are going to be pretty limited due to that 1/3 rule. That means that you'll either be looking for studios, 1 bedrooms, or, and this is my recommendation, getting a roommate. We'll talk more about how to choose the right roommate later in this video, but the fact is most people will end up having at least one roommate at some point. And this isn't a bad thing. Having a roommate makes it so you can rent a much larger space for half the price, as well as getting you approved for nicer apartments, so that's something to think about. And while we're on the topic of roommates, I know there's this romanticized idea of cramming 4 people into a 1 bedroom apartment to make rent, and if that works for you, then that's fine, but with that many people, you can almost always find a reasonably priced house to rent instead. And there are some definite drawbacks to this, like longer commute times, but if space is your main priority, renting a house is going to give you the best bang for your buck every time. Okay, now that's out of the way, let's get into what you should look for in an apartment, starting with your leasing agent. A good leasing agent is going to act professionally and make you feel welcome when you visit the property. I know this might seem like a weird one, but good property management companies care about making a good impression, and having a professional staff is a great indicator of that. And to go along with that, if your leasing agent is straightforward with you about costs and answering questions, then it's probably safe to assume that they're a good property. If you have concerns, it's really important that the person you're working with is honest with you and answers your questions directly instead of giving you the runaround. As far as the apartment itself goes, what you'll want to look for really depends on what your needs are going into it. Like if you plan on cooking your own meals, you need to make sure that the kitchen is going to accommodate that need. Or if you don't like doing dishes, you need to make sure that the apartment has a dishwasher. Basically, just think of anything that you want to do that isn't sleeping at the apartment and make a list of your wants according to that. One thing I've noticed is that a lot of apartments don't have ceiling lighting in the bedrooms, and I personally don't like the idea of buying a bunch of lamps just to be able to see in my space. So if you're like me in that way, definitely check to see where the light's coming from when you take a tour and make sure it's coming from ceiling lights. Also, don't underestimate the power of amenities. If you're already paying for a gym membership, but the apartment you're looking at has a fitness center with all of the machines that you would use anyway, you might be able to save some money by not having to pay for a gym membership anymore. Other than that, you should always make sure the location of the apartment works for you. It's best to rent somewhere that's close to where you spend most of your time, whether that's school or work, because it cuts down on travel costs and keeps your stress levels down, not to mention the time you save commuting, and just the time you save in general by living close to the places you go most often. I mentioned this earlier, but finding a good roommate will make the transition a lot easier as well, so I'll tell you what qualities to look for there. First, it's always ideal to find someone who's already renting somewhere else because that shows that they at least know the process of getting an apartment. It also lets you see how clean they keep their apartment so you know what to expect, and you can see any red flags before you sign a lease with this person. It helps if you know the person that you're moving in with so you have an idea of how they are, but whether or not you know them, the most important thing to keep in mind with a roommate is to be considerate. There are things that maybe wouldn't bother you that would bother your roommate and vice versa, so if you're considerate and use your best judgment, your relationship with your roommate should be a lot better. Anyway, that's all for this week's video. Tune in for the next one where we'll be talking about what things you need for your first apartment, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss that. Thank you guys for watching, like this video if you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time here at Market Apartments.